Imagine stepping into a cattle camp in the Texas Panhandle in 1882. The first thing that reaches you is not the dust, not the lowing cattle, not the creak of saddle leather. It is the smell, a warm, sour, rotting smell that hits the back of your throat before you open your mouth. It is the breath of the men sitting around the fire. Not one man. All of them. Every single man in that camp carries that same pungent cloud of decay. And not one of them notices it anymore, because in the American West of the 1880s, a rotting mouth was not unusual. It was ordinary. Forget the Hollywood cowboy, square-jawed and grinning with a full set of gleaming teeth. The real men who drove cattle from Texas to Kansas, who slept on the ground and drank from streams, who lived for months without setting foot in a town, those men were losing their teeth quietly, steadily, one by one, long before they reached middle age. This is that story, stripped of every myth, built from what the historical record actually shows. To understand what was happening to the mouths of men on the frontier, you have to understand the world they lived in. The 1880s were the peak years of the great cattle drives. The Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail. Tens of thousands of cattle moved north every spring, tended by crews of 8 to 20 men who spent 3 to 4 months in the saddle, covering 2,000 miles of open country. These men were young, between 15 and 30 years old. They were also, by any measure of dental health, living in a crisis they had no word for. There were no dentists on the trail. There were no toothbrushes, either. Not because they did not exist, but because they were expensive and considered a luxury for city people. Most working cowboys had never owned one. Here is the detail that reframes everything. Stagecoach stations and public eating houses kept a single toothbrush hanging by the door on a shared hook. One brush for every traveler who passed through, every mouth, every disease, every infection, on the same bristles. That was the standard of dental hygiene available in the Old West, and most cowboys never even had access to that. Now think about what those mouths were eating. The cattle trail diet was built around 3 things: beef, beans, and biscuits. The chuck wagon, the mobile kitchen that fed the entire crew, carried flour, dried beans, salt pork, and coffee. If the cook was resourceful, he added dried apples or peaches, but a typical drive lasted 60 to 90 days, and fresh produce spoiled within 3 days in the heat of the southern plains. After the first week, the fruit was gone. This was not merely uncomfortable, it was physiologically destructive. Without vitamin C, the human body cannot synthesize collagen, the protein anchoring teeth into the jaw. The condition has a name: scurvy. The first symptoms, bleeding gums and loosening teeth, can appear in as few as 4 to 6 weeks without fresh produce. A drive that lasted 80 days was more than enough time. One historical account describes it plainly, noting that scurvy was quite common among cowboys, whose diet was almost exclusively dried beef and hardtack for months at a stretch. The gums swell, they bleed, they pull away, and the teeth begin to loosen from the gums. Then they fall out. Not in old age, on the trail, at 22, at 26, at 28. Think about that next time you skip a meal of vegetables and consider it a minor inconvenience. But the diet was only part of the problem. The other part was sugar. Coffee was the one true luxury on the cattle trail, and cowboys drank it constantly, thick, black, and loaded with brown sugar when the supply held. Sugar was also added to biscuits, to beans, to whatever the cook could sweeten to make the monotony bearable. And in frontier towns at the end of a drive, a cowboy with money in his pocket went straight for the saloon, where he drank cheap whiskey and spent his wages on candy and sweetened tobacco. The tobacco deserves a closer look because it was everywhere, and it was doing serious damage. Most working cowboys used plug tobacco. A plug was a compressed block of cured tobacco leaves mixed with molasses or licorice, costing 5 to 10 cents, within reach of almost any working man. Cowboys bit off a piece, tucked it between cheek and gum, and kept it there for hours, sometimes through an entire shift in the saddle. The combination of fermented leaf, sugar, and acid sat pressed against the tooth surface in a continuous attack that no amount of saliva could neutralize. The result was not the slow kind of decay that builds over decades. It was the rapid kind, the kind that opens a cavity in weeks, reaches the pulp within a season, and produces an abscess, a pocket of infection at the root, that swells the jaw and sends a throbbing pain up through the skull from the moment a man wakes until he collapses into sleep. Some abscesses drained through a fistula, a channel the infection carves through the gum tissue, leaving a sore that reopened every few weeks. Most cowboys called it a bad tooth. They endured it until they could not. What happened when the pain became unbearable? That is where the story gets darker. There was no such thing as a routine dental appointment on the frontier. If you had a toothache in an 1880s cattle town, your options were few. The first was to buy toothache drops from the general store. In 1885, the Lloyd Manufacturing Company of Albany, New York, began selling cocaine toothache drops over the counter, advertised for children and adults alike. The bottle cost 15 cents. The packaging showed a smiling child holding a tooth. The advertising ran in newspapers as naturally as any advertisement for soap, because cocaine was a legal ingredient with no regulatory framework around it at all. The drops worked. The cocaine numbed the pain within minutes. And that was precisely the problem. A man in constant pain finally found something that made it disappear. He used the drops. The next day, the pain returned. He used them again. Within a week, he was using them because the day felt long without them. The tooth was still rotting. The abscess was still building. The cocaine made it possible to ignore the thing that was quietly killing him from the jaw up. The second option was to find someone who could pull the tooth out. And here is where the distinction between frontier dentistry and frontier brutality becomes impossible to draw. In the 1880s, the person most likely to extract your tooth was not a trained dentist. It was the barber. Barbers across the frontier operated as general practitioners of the face and jaw. They shaved you, cut your hair, and when your tooth became unbearable, they reached for a pair of pliers. Not dental pliers, pliers from the tool shelf. The technique was not subtle, and it was not quick. The patient sat in the barber chair. There was no anesthesia. The barber gripped the tooth with the pliers, planted the flat of the instrument against the surrounding gum tissue for leverage, and began to rotate and pull. The roots of a molar extend a full centimeter below the gum line, curving like hooks into the jawbone. Pulling one out without breaking it required precise knowledge of root anatomy. Barbers did not have that knowledge. They pulled. If the tooth did not come, they pulled harder. Witnesses described the sound of a molar separating from the jaw without being asked to, which tells you something about what it was like to be in the room. The result was frequently a dislocated jaw. Sometimes the wrong tooth came out. Sometimes the roots broke off inside the bone, where they festered for weeks before the infection found another way out. In 1886, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, A frontier dentist drilled the wrong tooth from a man named Clay Allison, a rancher well known for his violent temper. Allison returned to the dentist's office, pinned the man to his own chair, took the pliers from his instrument tray, and pulled one of the dentist's teeth out of his head. Passers-by stopped him before he could remove a second. That story is usually told as a comedy. It should be understood as a document of how desperate men were, how unregulated the practice was, how completely alone a person was with their pain on the American frontier. Doc Holliday is the most famous dentist of the Old West. He graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in 1872, credentialed and skilled. He took prizes at the Dallas County Fair in 1873 for the best set of teeth in gold and the best set of artificial teeth and dental wear. He was exactly what the frontier needed. But Doc Holliday had tuberculosis. His coughing fits grew worse and came at the worst possible moments, with instruments in a patient's mouth. No one wanted a consumptive dentist coughing over an open jaw. He abandoned dentistry for gambling within 2 years. The best-trained dentist on the frontier graduated with prizes and was gone within 2 years. Not because he lacked skill, not because there was no need, but because the same world that was rotting every cowboy's teeth drove out the one man with the knowledge to stop it. He died in 1887 in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, at 36. The cowboys who might have sat in his chair were left with the barber and the pliers. And yet, it would be easy to look at this record and see only suffering. Men reduced to gumming their food by 30, white-knuckling an extraction with no anesthesia, self-medicating with a product designed for children. It would be easy to feel nothing but pity. But that reading misses something essential. They knew what they were doing was hard. They chose it anyway. A cowboy on the Chisholm Trail earned roughly $30 a month in conditions that would be considered a humanitarian crisis today. They did it because the alternative was worse: tenant farming, factory labor, poverty in an eastern city with no future. The frontier was brutal, but it was open. And these men, with rotting teeth and bleeding gums, with cocaine drops in their vest pockets, they drove more than 5 million cattle north between 1867 and 1884. They built an industry. They shaped a country, without a single toothbrush between them. We should not look at them with disgust. We should look at them with something much closer to awe. One last image to carry with you. Somewhere out on the Western Trail in the summer of 1880, a young cowboy sits at a fire after a long day in the saddle. He's 24 and missing 3 teeth. He wraps a strip of cloth around a twig, dips it in the coffee grounds at the bottom of his tin cup, and rubs it across what remains. It is not effective. He knows that. He does it anyway because it is all there is. The cattle are settled. The sky is enormous. Tomorrow he will ride again, and the day after that, until the drive ends and he collects his $30 and starts again. The suffering was real. So was the life.